The wind howls across the frozen landscape of Siberia, carrying with it the echoes of a century-old mystery. Picture yourself standing in the darkness of a Siberian night in July 1918. Snow crunches beneath your feet as you approach a modest two-story house on Voznesensky Lane in the city of Yekaterinburg. The building looks ordinary, unremarkable, just another merchant's house in a provincial Russian town. But inside these walls, soldiers are rushing through rooms that once housed the most powerful family on earth. Their boots echo against wooden floors as they search frantically through drawers, wardrobes, and hidden compartments. In their hands, they clutch more than just weapons. They hold the keys to one of history's greatest unsolved puzzles. As soldiers are looking for something specific, not documents or evidence of counter-revolutionary activities. They're hunting for treasure jewels, gold, precious objects that could fund armies or topple governments. What they find will astound them. What they don't find will create a mystery that haunts us to this day. One question has echoed across a century, whispered in the auction houses of London and New York, debated in the academic halls of Oxford and Moscow, and pursued by treasure hunters from the mountains of Switzerland to the forests of Siberia. What happened to the Romanov treasure? The numbers are staggering. We're talking about wealth that would make modern billionaires look like paupers. 50 imperial Easter eggs crafted by the legendary Peter Carl Fabergé, each one worth more than most people earn in a lifetime. Diamond tiaras containing stones the size of walnuts. Emerald necklaces that once graced the necks of empresses. Gold dinner services that could feed entire cities. Art collections that filled palaces from St. Petersburg to the Crimea. Conservative estimates place the total value at over $300 billion in today's money. But this wasn't just wealth. It was power made manifest in precious metal and stone. Every jewel told a story of conquest. Every golden object represented the divine right of kings. Tonight we journey into the heart of Imperial Russia, where golden eggs worth millions of dollars vanished into thin air, where diamonds sewn into children's clothing became their final tragic armor, and where the greatest collection of jewels the world had ever seen simply disappeared without a trace. This is not just a story about gold and gemstones. This is a tale of power, betrayal, revolution, and the eternal human obsession with mystery. Today, we'll unravel conspiracies that span continents, dive into secret sales that funded communist revolutions, expose Nazi connections to stolen imperial treasures, and discover how a fortune lost in 1918 still impacts stock markets, diplomatic relations, and treasure hunters in the 21st century. We'll meet the American scrap metal dealer who almost melted down a $20 million Fabergé egg. We'll explore Swiss bank vaults that may still contain Romanov gold. We'll follow the trail of imperial jewels that ended up in the jewelry boxes of suburban families who never knew they possessed the crown jewels of Russia. The treasure of the Romanovs awaits. The greatest treasure hunt in history begins now. For 3 centuries, the House of Romanov didn't just rule Russia, they owned it. From 1613 to 1917, 14 Tsars accumulated wealth that defied the imagination of their subjects and amazed visiting foreign dignitaries. This wasn't mere royal extravagance. It was wealth on a scale that made the pharaohs of Egypt look like provincial merchants. The foundation of this incredible fortune was laid by Peter the Great in the early 18th century. Peter understood that a modern empire needed modern symbols of power. He began systematically acquiring art, jewels, and precious objects from across Europe. When he built St. Petersburg, he filled it with treasures that would announce Russia's arrival as a great power. But it was Catherine the Great who truly understood the political power of spectacular wealth. During her 34-year reign, she expanded the imperial collection exponentially. Her agents scoured Europe for the finest art, the rarest jewels, the most exquisite decorative objects. She purchased entire collections from bankrupt nobles, commissioned works from the greatest artists of her age, and turned the Winter Palace into a monument to imperial power. By the time Tsar Nicholas II inherited the throne in 1894, the Romanov family possessed wealth that simply cannot be compared to anything in the modern world. The numbers tell only part of the story. The Winter Palace alone housed over 50,000 works of art. The imperial collection included 5,000 pieces of jewelry containing more than 200,000 precious stones. They owned over 500 palaces, residences, and hunting lodges scattered across the vast Russian Empire. But to understand the true scope of Romanov wealth, we need to look beyond mere numbers. In the imperial stables, the ceremonial carriages were plated with gold and decorated with diamonds. The handles on the doors were made of carved ivory inlaid with precious stones. Even the horses wore decorative equipment crafted by the finest jewelers in Europe. The dining rooms of the various palaces contained dinner services made entirely of gold, not gold-plated solid gold. Guests at imperial banquets ate from plates that weighed several pounds each, used utensils encrusted with gems, and drank from goblets that individual pieces were worth more than most nobles' annual incomes. The imperial wardrobe was equally extravagant. Empress Alexandra owned over 600 formal gowns, many decorated with thousands of pearls and precious stones. Her jewelry collection alone contained 244 major pieces, including necklaces, tiaras, bracelets, and brooches that had been accumulated over centuries of royal marriages and diplomatic gifts. But perhaps no objects better represented the pinnacle of Romanov wealth than the imperial Easter eggs created by Peter Karl Fabergé. Beginning in 1885, Tsar Alexander III commissioned Fabergé to create a special Easter gift for his wife. The tradition continued under Nicholas II, who ordered 2 eggs each year, one for his wife and one for his mother. Each egg required a full year to complete and represented the absolute pinnacle of goldsmith artistry. The eggs contained intricate mechanical surprises, miniature replicas of the Trans-Siberian Railway, working models of the imperial yacht, tiny portraits of the royal family that could be viewed through microscopic lenses. The level of craftsmanship was so extraordinary that modern jewelers struggle to understand how they were created. The blue serpent clock egg, created in 1895, contained a working clock mechanism with diamond numbers and a serpent that moved to indicate the time. The coronation egg of 1897 featured a perfect replica of the imperial coronation coach, complete with moving wheels, opening doors, and tiny figures inside. The rose trellis egg was covered in over 1,300 diamonds arranged in a pattern of climbing roses. But the Romanov collection extended far beyond Fabergé eggs. The family owned entire buildings filled with Chinese porcelain, Japanese lacquerware, and Islamic metalwork. They possessed medieval manuscripts illuminated with gold leaf, Renaissance paintings by Leonardo da Vinci and Raphael, and contemporary works by the greatest artists of their time. The Imperial Library contained over 500,000 volumes, including unique manuscripts and first editions that existed nowhere else on Earth. Many of these books were bound in leather, decorated with the imperial coat of arms in gold and precious stones. Even their religious objects were spectacular. The imperial chapel contained orthodox icons decorated with diamonds, rubies, and emeralds. The altarpieces were crafted from solid gold and included reliquaries containing precious stones the size of eggs. The scale of this wealth becomes clear when we consider that the annual budget of the entire Russian Empire in 1914 was approximately 3.5 billion rubles. The imperial household's annual expenses alone approached 20 million rubles more than the total budget of most European nations. By 1917, revolution was brewing across Russia. The people, suffering from the devastation of World War I, growing famine, and economic collapse, looked upon this incredible wealth with a mixture of awe and rage. Bolshevik revolutionaries pointed to the imperial treasures as evidence of the monarchy as disconnect from the suffering of ordinary Russians. Lenin himself frequently referenced the Romanov wealth in his speeches, calling it the stolen wealth of the people and promising that a communist revolution would redistribute these treasures to benefit all Russians. The imperial collection became a symbol of everything the revolutionaries sought to destroy. As bombs exploded in St. Petersburg and revolutionary crowds stormed government buildings, the Romanov family faced a terrible choice. They could flee Russia and abandon their treasures, or they could stay and risk everything in the hope that loyal forces would restore order. Nicholas II chose to stay, believing that his abdication would satisfy the revolutionaries and that he could live quietly in Russia with his family. It was perhaps the most costly miscalculation in the history of imperial wealth. In March 1917, Tsar Nicholas II signed his abdication decree in a railway car in the small town of Pskov. The 3th-century dynasty of the Romanovs was officially over, but their treasure remained, scattered across dozens of palaces, hidden in secret vaults, and deposited in bank boxes across Europe. What happened to this unimaginable wealth would create one of history's greatest mysteries and launch a treasure hunt that continues to this day. But first, the Romanov family had to survive their own revolution, a challenge that would prove far more difficult than they ever imagined. The date was July 16, 1918. The location: a modest house in Yekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains of Siberia. The Ipativ house, which locals would later call the House of Special Purpose, was about to become the stage for the most infamous execution in Russian history. Tsar Nicholas II, Empress Alexandra, and their 5 children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and young Alexei had been imprisoned in this house for 78 days. With them were their loyal servants, Dr. Eugene Botkin, lady-in-waiting Anna Demidova, footman Alexei Trupp, and head cook Ivan Karatanov. The conditions were harsh. The family, once accustomed to palaces and servants, now lived under constant guard. The windows were painted white so they couldn't see outside. Their meals were simple peasant food. But even in captivity, they maintained one secret that would later fuel decades of conspiracy theories. During their months of imprisonment, the Romanov women had been secretly sewing precious jewels into their clothing. Diamonds, rubies, and pearls were carefully stitched into corsets and underwear. The children wore what amounted to armor made of precious stones and estimated 18 pounds of gems and gold hidden in their garments. At 11:30 p.m. on July 16th, Yakov Virovsky, the chief executioner, woke the family. He told them they needed to move to the basement for their safety. Czechoslovakian forces were approaching the city, and there might be fighting. The family dressed quickly. The children, unknowingly, pulled on their jewel-encrusted clothing for the last time. In the basement room, measuring just 17 by 13 feet, the family and their servants lined up against the wall. Nicholas held his son Alexei, who was too weak from hemophilia to stand. Yurovsky read a brief statement. "Your relatives have tried to save you. They have failed, and now we must shoot you." What happened next was chaos. The first volley of bullets killed Nicholas instantly. Alexandra had time to cross herself before she too fell. But something extraordinary occurred. The children didn't die immediately. The jewels sewn into their clothing acted like armor, deflecting bullets and causing them to ricochet around the small room. The sound of gunfire mixed with screams and the ping of bullets hitting precious stones. Alexei, wounded but still alive, was finished off with the butt of Yurovsky's gun. The other children were killed with bayonets, their jeweled clothing finally pierced by sharp steel. 11 people died in that basement room. But the mystery was just beginning. As Yurovsky and his men loaded the bodies onto a truck, they made a discovery that would haunt historians for over a century. The clothing was heavy with hidden treasure diamonds that could fund armies, rubies that could purchase nations, pearls that emperors had coveted. But here's where the official story begins to unravel. Yurovsky reported confiscating these jewels from the bodies. Soviet records show that some gems were recovered, but witnesses later claimed that the amount of treasure found was impossibly small compared to what the Romanov family was known to possess. Where were the Fabergé eggs? Where were the crown jewels? Where were the famous Romanov diamond tiaras, the emerald parures, the sapphire collections that had taken centuries to assemble? The bodies were driven deep into the forest, doused with sulfuric acid and buried in unmarked graves. But what happened to the treasure created questions that echo to this day. Did the Bolsheviks find everything? Were loyal servants hiding caches of imperial wealth? Had treasures already been smuggled out of Russia before the execution? As dawn broke over Yekaterinburg on July 17, 1918, the Romanov dynasty was dead. But their treasure had vanished into the shadows of history, launching a mystery that would consume treasure hunters, historians, and conspiracy theorists for the next 100 years. The hunt for the lost Romanov treasure was about to begin. Within days of the execution, something extraordinary and deeply mysterious began happening across Russia and Europe. It was as if the Romanov treasure had somehow learned to move through time and space, appearing and disappearing like ghosts in the machine of international commerce. The first signs appeared in the most unexpected places. On August 15, 1918, barely 1 month after the execution in Yekaterinburg, a mysterious package arrived at Wartsky, the prestigious London jewelry house that had been Fabergé's official representative in Britain. Inside was an imperial Easter egg, the 1903 Peter the Great egg, wrapped in ordinary brown paper with no return address. The accompanying note, written in perfect English, simply stated, "For immediate sale. Seller wishes to remain anonymous. Price negotiable." The handwriting analysis conducted decades later suggested the note had been written by someone with aristocratic education, possibly Russian, but the identity of the seller was never established. How had this precious object, last seen in the Alexander Palace near St. Petersburg, traveled across a continent torn by revolution and civil war? How had it crossed borders guarded by hostile armies and reached London so quickly? The logistics seemed impossible, yet the egg was undeniably genuine. Similar mysterious appearances occurred across Europe throughout 1918 and 1919. A Fabergé cigarette case surfaced at a pawn shop in Stockholm. Russian imperial jewelry appeared at auction houses in Paris and Geneva. Orthodox icons decorated with precious stones were offered for sale in Berlin and Vienna. Each appearance raised more questions than it answered. The timing was suspicious. These objects appeared too quickly after the revolution to have been smuggled out through normal channels. The quantities were puzzling too few to represent deliberate large-scale trafficking, but too many to be coincidental. By 1920, the pattern became even more intriguing. Soviet records from this period show that the Bolshevik government had conducted comprehensive inventories of all confiscated imperial treasures. The bureaucrats were meticulous, cataloging everything from diamond tiaras to silver teaspoons. But when historians later compared these Soviet inventories to pre-revolutionary records of the Romanov collection, massive discrepancies emerged. Of the 50 imperial Easter eggs known to have been completed by Fabergé, Soviet inventories listed only 24. 8 eggs were documented as having been sold to Western buyers, but that left 18 eggs completely unaccounted for. Where had they gone? Who had taken them? When had they disappeared? The missing eggs were just the beginning. The Romanov jewelry collection, once appraised by imperial jewelers at over 100 million rubles, had apparently shrunk to a fraction of its former size. Major pieces that had been photographed at court ceremonies just years earlier were simply gone from Soviet records. But perhaps most mysteriously, some of the most valuable items in the collection pieces that would have been the first targets of any systematic looting were apparently never found by the Bolsheviks at all. The diamond diadem of Empress Elizabeth, containing 2,536 diamonds and weighing over 4 pounds, was not listed in any Soviet inventory. The Great Sapphire of Catherine the Great, a stone so large it was used as the centerpiece of the imperial crown, had vanished without a trace. This is where the treasure hunt really begins, because the patterns of disappearance suggested something far more sophisticated than random looting or hasty evacuation. The missing objects weren't just the smallest and most portable items. They included large, heavy, and extremely valuable pieces that would have required careful planning and significant resources to move. 3 distinct theories emerged from this evidence, each pointing in a different direction, each supported by tantalizing clues and frustrating gaps in the historical record. Theory 1. The mountain cache theory. The first theory focused on the geography and timing of the Romanov family's final months. Between August 1917 and July 1918, the family had been moved from palace to palace, finally ending up in Yekaterinburg. During this period, they were accompanied by a small group of loyal servants who had volunteered to share their exile. Local legends in the Ural Mountains tell of mysterious nighttime activities during this period. Peasants living near Tobolsk, where the family was imprisoned from August 1917 to May 1918, reported seeing trucks loaded with heavy wooden boxes driving into the forest under cover of darkness. The trucks would return empty, and their drivers never spoke about their destinations. What gives these local legends credibility is the geological evidence. The Ural Mountains are honeycombed with old mining shafts, some dating back centuries. These abandoned mines would have provided perfect hiding places for valuable objects deep, dry, and virtually impossible to find without specific knowledge of their locations. Mining engineers working in the region during the 1920s and 1930s reported finding unusual disturbances in the earth areas where soil had clearly been excavated and carefully replaced. The locations of these disturbances matched the areas where peasants had reported seeing the mysterious truck convoys. More compelling still were the metal detector readings. Even with the primitive equipment available in the early 20th century, prospectors reported significant metallic anomalies in several locations near Tobolsk. The Soviet government quickly classified these areas as restricted mining zones, making further investigation impossible. The mountain cache theory gained credibility from the behavior of the Romanov family's guards. Several guards who served at Tobolsk were quietly transferred to other assignments before the family was moved to Yekaterinburg. Years later, some of these guards were observed living well above their expected means, purchasing property and supporting lifestyles that their official salaries could not explain. Theory 2. The European escape route. The second theory focuses on the extensive network of European royal families connected to the Romanovs. Empress Alexandra was the granddaughter of Queen Victoria, making her a first cousin to Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany and a close relative of virtually every royal house in Europe. These family connections provided more than just emotional support. They offered practical escape, routes for people and treasures fleeing revolutionary Russia. The theory suggests that beginning in late 1917, a systematic operation began moving the most valuable Romanov treasures out of Russia through established diplomatic and royal channels. Evidence supporting this theory comes from multiple sources. Swedish customs records from 1917 to 1918 show unusual diplomatic shipments leaving Russia through Finnish and Baltic ports. These shipments were classified as personal effects of diplomatic personnel, but their weight and size suggest they contained far more than clothing and personal items. The timing of these shipments is significant. Most occurred during the brief period when the provisional government controlled Russia, before the Bolsheviks had established full authority over customs and border controls. This created a window of opportunity when valuable objects could be moved out of the country with minimal oversight. More intriguing are the banking records. Swiss banks in the 1920s began receiving significant deposits of gold and precious objects from accounts linked to European royal families. The Bank of Geneva, in particular, showed deposits that corresponded almost exactly with the periods when missing Romanov treasures began appearing at European auction houses. The European theory also explains the superior preservation of many Romanov objects that surfaced in Western collections. These pieces showed none of the damage or deterioration that might be expected if they had been hastily hidden or buried. Instead, they appeared to have been carefully maintained in controlled environments, exactly what might be expected if they had been placed in the care of European royal households or professional art dealers. Theory 3. Soviet secret sales. The third and perhaps most controversial theory suggests that the Bolsheviks found far more of the Romanov treasure than they ever admitted publicly, and began systematically selling it to fund the new Soviet state. This theory is supported by the harsh economic realities facing the Bolshevik government. The Russian economy had collapsed during World War I and the subsequent Civil War. The new Soviet state desperately needed foreign currency to purchase industrial equipment, food, and raw materials from Western countries that refused to recognize the communist government. Lenin himself had authorized the sale of Russian art treasures as early as 1918. The official policy was to convert artifacts of the parasitic aristocratic class into resources for the working people. But the official sales represented only a fraction of what the Romanov collection contained. The evidence for secret sales comes from multiple sources. Western auction houses in the 1920s and 1930s suddenly gained access to Russian imperial objects that had never been publicly displayed. Major collectors like Henry Clay Frick in New York and Samuel Courtauld in London acquired extensive collections of Russian art during this period, often paying prices significantly below market value. Most tellingly, the pattern of Soviet sales showed sophisticated market management. Rather than flooding the market with Russian treasures, which would have driven down prices, objects appeared gradually over many years. This suggested a deliberate strategy to maximize revenue while avoiding unwanted attention. By 1930, 12 years after the execution, professional treasure hunters had scoured the Ural Mountains without finding significant caches. European authorities had investigated suspicious art sales and diplomatic shipments without uncovering major conspiracies. Swiss banks had been discreetly questioned about unusual deposits without revealing significant information. But the treasure hunt was far from over. It was simply entering a new phase one that would be shaped by the rise of Nazi Germany, the chaos of World War II, and the emergence of a global art market that would transform how we think about lost treasures and their recovery. The mystery had deepened rather than resolved. Instead of finding answers, the treasure hunters had discovered new questions, new possibilities, and new reasons to believe that the greatest fortune in history was still out there, waiting to be found. The disappearance of the Romanov treasure gave birth to conspiracy theories that would span continents and generations. Each theory reveals something profound about human nature: our need to find patterns in chaos, our suspicion of official narratives, and our eternal fascination with hidden wealth. The European royal connection conspiracy. The most persistent theory centers on European royalty. Empress Alexandra was the granddaughter of Queen Victoria, making her closely related to the British royal family. Tsar Nicholas II was first cousin to King George V of England and Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. When revolution erupted in Russia, these family connections became both lifelines and sources of scandal. The conspiracy suggests that months before the execution, trusted agents began secretly shipping Romanov treasures to royal relatives across Europe. The timing seemed too convenient to ignore. In late 1917, as the Bolsheviks consolidated power, mysterious shipments left Russia through Finland and the Baltic states. Swedish customs records from this period show unusual cargo, manifest diplomatic pouches of extraordinary weight and size. The most tantalizing evidence comes from an unexpected source. In 2009, archivists at the Swedish Foreign Ministry discovered 2 pillowcases in their basement, forgotten for nearly a century. The Grand Duchess didn't have time to tell her relatives about the cash before she died in 2 pillowcases, containing about 60 items of jewelry, Fabergé cigarette cases, gold cufflinks adorned with precious stones and other items, were only discovered in the archives of the Swedish ministry. The items belonged to Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna, who had fled Russia in 1917. But if she had managed to smuggle out this much treasure, what about other family members? The conspiracy deepened when researchers discovered that several European royal collections had quietly acquired Russian pieces during the 1920s. The British Royal Collection, the Danish crown jewels, and private collections of German nobility all showed Russian imperial objects with suspiciously vague provenance records. The Swiss gold conspiracy Switzerland in the 1920s was the perfect location for hiding stolen wealth. Banking secrecy laws protected depositors, and the country's neutrality made it attractive to people fleeing political upheaval. The Swiss gold conspiracy suggests that massive amounts of Romanov treasure ended up in numbered accounts in Zurich, Geneva, and Basel. The theory gained credibility in 1986 when Swiss authorities investigated dormant accounts from the World War I era. They discovered that between 1918 and 1925, Swiss banks had received extraordinary deposits of gold, precious stones, and valuable objects from Russian sources. The total value was estimated at over 300 million Swiss francs, an enormous sum for that era. Even more intriguingly, several of these accounts showed evidence of Fabergé objects being used as collateral for loans. Bank records, carefully preserved in Swiss vaults, described Russian imperial eggs of gold and precious stones, diamond-encrusted religious objects of Orthodox origin. But here's where the conspiracy becomes even more complex. Some researchers believe that these Swiss deposits weren't just hidden Romanov wealth. They were part of a deliberate Soviet strategy. Stalin's government needed hard currency to buy Western technology and weapons. What better way to raise funds than by secretly selling imperial treasures while publicly claiming they had been lost during the revolution? The Nazi connection, perhaps the most sinister conspiracy theory, connects the Romanov treasure to Nazi Germany as systematic looting of European art during World War II. Hitler's agents were known to be obsessed with acquiring symbols of imperial power, and the Romanov collection represented the ultimate prize. The theory suggests that some Romanov treasures, hidden in European banks and private collections, were seized by the Nazis between 1939 and 1945. SS Oberfuhrer Kajetan Muhlmann, Hitler's art looting coordinator, kept detailed records of confiscated objects. Recently declassified documents show that his team specifically sought Russian imperial objects, particularly those of the House of Romanov. Even more disturbing is the possibility that some Nazi-looted Romanov treasures ended up in the hands of escaping war criminals after 1945. The infamous rat lines that helped Nazis flee to South America might have also served as conduits for stolen imperial treasures. In 1998, investigators searching for Nazi gold in Argentina discovered a cache of Russian Orthodox religious objects dating to the imperial period. The objects bore markings consistent with Romanov chapel pieces that had been missing since 1918. The discovery raised chilling questions about how deep the Nazi connection to the Romanov treasure really went. The Tobolsk burial legend. Local legends in Siberia tell a different story entirely. According to these accounts, the most valuable Romanov treasures never left Russia at all. During their imprisonment in Tobolsk, before being moved to Yekaterinburg, the Romanov family allegedly buried their most precious possessions near the town. The legend speaks of a moonless night in March 1918, when loyal servants dug graves, not for bodies, but for treasure. They buried Fabergé eggs in the frozen earth, wrapped in oilcloth and placed in metal containers. They hid jewelry collections in waterproof boxes, buried along the banks of the Irtysh River. What gives this legend credibility is the testimony of local residents. For generations, Families in Tobolsk have passed down stories of mysterious nighttime activities in the weeks before the Romanovs were moved to their final prison. Metal detectors operated by treasure hunters in the 1990s registered significant anomalies in areas described by these oral traditions. The legend gained international attention in 2005 when a Russian treasure hunting team claimed to have found evidence of disturbed earth in patterns consistent with deliberate burial. Ground-penetrating radar showed rectangular anomalies at depths and locations matching the legendary burial sites. The modern auction house mystery. The conspiracy theories gained new life in the 21st century as Romanov objects continued appearing at auction houses worldwide. Between 2000 and 2020, major auction houses sold dozens of items with confirmed or probable Romanov provenance. The total value exceeded $500 million. But the ownership history of these objects often contained suspicious gaps. Items would appear with documentation showing they had been in a European private collection since the 1920s, with no further details. Auction house specialists, bound by client confidentiality, could not reveal who was selling these pieces or how they had acquired them. The pattern became clear. Someone or some organization had maintained access to a steady supply of Romanov treasures for over a century. The objects were being released gradually, in small quantities, to avoid flooding the market and driving down prices. Some investigators believe this points to an organized conspiracy involving Swiss banks, European noble families, and Soviet authorities. The theory suggests that the lost Romanov treasure was never really lost at all. It was carefully managed and gradually liquidated over decades. Each conspiracy theory reveals more about fear, power, and secrecy than about the actual fate of the treasure. They show how historical mysteries can become focal points for our deepest suspicions about authority, wealth, and truth. But none of these theories provide the full answer to what happened on that night in 1918, when the richest family in the world vanished, leaving behind only questions that echo through the corridors of time. The conspiracies continue because the truth remains hidden, buried somewhere between documented history and the endless human need to believe that nothing ever truly disappears. That wealth, like energy, cannot be destroyed, only transformed and hidden, waiting for the right moment to emerge from the shadows of the past. Behind the grand conspiracy theories and dramatic legends lie facts that are often more surprising than fiction. Here are 3 things about the Romanov treasure that even history enthusiasts don't know. Whilst there are detailed records of the 52 Fabergé eggs, which were gifted by the royal family during this time, the whereabouts of only 46 of them are accounted for. But here is what's truly shocking. Many of the eggs we do know about disappeared completely from 1918 to 1990, only to resurface in the most unexpected places. Take the 3rd imperial Easter egg, created in 1887. After the revolution, it vanished without a trace. For over 90 years, it existed only in old photographs and Fabergé's workshop records. Then, in 2014, an American scrap metal dealer bought what he thought was an unremarkable golden trinket at a flea market in the Midwest. He planned to melt it down for the gold value, about $500. When he had trouble finding a buyer, he researched the strange markings on the object. What he discovered changed his life. He had accidentally purchased a Fabergé imperial Easter egg worth over $20 million. The egg had somehow traveled from revolutionary Russia to an American flea market, surviving nearly a century in hiding. Even more remarkable is the story of the Fabergé Rothschild clock egg, which disappeared in 1917. It resurfaced in 2007 when Christie's auction house received it from an anonymous seller. The bidding war was so intense that it sold for over $18 million at the time, the most expensive Fabergé object ever sold at auction. But here's the mystery. How did these objects survive the Soviet period? The official Soviet line was that imperial treasures had been either destroyed or sold to Western capitalists in the 1920s. Yet these eggs showed no signs of having been in state custody. Their preservation was too perfect, their hiding too sophisticated. The truth appears to be that dedicated individual servants, collectors, or possibly even Soviet officials secretly preserved these masterpieces for decades, waiting for the right moment to reveal them. The Fabergé eggs didn't just survive the Russian Revolution. They survived Stalin's purges, World War II, and the Cold War, hidden in private collections that maintained their secrecy for nearly 8 decades. The most stunning revelation about the Romanov treasure is how much of it is hiding in plain sight, woven into the fabric of our daily lives in ways that would shock most people. Major museums, private collections, and even ordinary families possess Romanov jewelry and artifacts, often without knowing their true origin or understanding the incredible journey these objects have taken through history. Consider this. In 1922, the Soviet government conducted what they claimed was a complete inventory of all confiscated imperial treasures. The bureaucrats were methodical, cataloging everything from diamond tiaras to silver teaspoons. But when modern historians compare this Soviet inventory to pre-revolutionary records of the Romanov collection, the discrepancies are staggering. The Soviet inventory listed approximately 40,000 objects confiscated from imperial palaces. But palace inventories from 1916 show that the Romanovs owned over 275,000 cataloged items of value. Where did the other 235,000 objects go? The simple answer is that they scattered across the globe, entering private collections, museums, and estate sales where their imperial origins were often forgotten or deliberately obscured. The trail these pieces have followed reads like a treasure hunter's dream. Romanov jewelry sold by the Soviet government in the 1920s and 1930s ended up in the collections of American industrialists like Henry Clay Frick, Andrew Mellon, and Marjorie Merriweather Post. When these titans of industry died, their estates were donated to museums, sold to other collectors, or distributed to family members who often had only vague awareness of what they possessed. Today, if you visit the right museums, you can see Romanov treasures displayed as part of permanent collections. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York houses several Fabergé objects with confirmed Romanov provenance. The Walters Art Museum in Baltimore displays Russian imperial jewelry acquired during the Soviet sales. The Virginia Museum of Fine Arts owns pieces that once belonged to Grand Duchess Vladimir. But these museum pieces represent only the tip of the iceberg. Hundreds of Romanov objects remain in private hands, their owners often unaware of the imperial connection. The pattern repeats constantly. Families inherit nice old jewelry or interesting Russian antiques without realizing they possess pieces that once belonged to the most powerful dynasty in Europe. The stories of accidental discovery are remarkable. In 2003, an elderly woman in Paris brought what she described as her grandmother's diamond necklace to an appraiser. The family had owned it for 3 generations, believing it to be a nice piece, probably French. The appraiser's research revealed that the necklace had originally belonged to Grand Duchess Maria Nikolaevna, daughter of Tsar Nicholas I. It had been sold by the Soviet government in 1928, purchased by a French collector, and passed down through 3 generations of a middle-class family who had no idea they owned imperial Russian jewelry worth over $2 million. Similar discoveries occur regularly. In 2011, a family cleaning out their grandmother's house in Chicago found a small golden egg decorated with enamel and gems. They nearly donated it to charity before a neighbor suggested they have it appraised. The dispersal pattern shows the global reach of the Romanov collection. Objects purchased during the Soviet sales found their way into collections in North America, South America, Europe, and Asia. Many were resold multiple times, each transaction further obscuring their imperial origins. Estate sales, auction houses, and private dealers created a distribution network It scattered Romanov treasures across 6 continents. What makes this dispersal even more remarkable is how well preserved many of these objects are. Unlike treasures that were buried or hidden, the Romanov objects that entered legitimate collections were carefully maintained. They were cleaned, repaired when necessary, necklace had once belonged to Grand Duchess Maria Nikolaevna, daughter of Tsar Nicholas I. It had been sold by the Soviet government in 1928, purchased by a French collector, and passed down through 3 the discovery of another imperial object, another piece of the puzzle that historians and intentional. Modern Russia views the Romanov treasure as more than historical employ teams of scientists, art historians, and technical experts who use to scan thousands of square miles of Siberian forest from their computers, looking for anomalies that might indicate Romanov treasures without knowing their true significance, storing priceless seemingly ordinary objects are actually fragments of the greatest mystery in history. The next time you visit an